Hello, this is Matt Burns from the University of Missouri. Today we're talking about cross-cultural competence in academic interventions. Really important conversation that I try and infuse throughout different lectures and such when I teach courses, because it shouldn't just be one topic for one lesson. It should be infused throughout. But we need to also spend at least some time focusing explicitly on cross-cultural competence. So I'm going to start with a few basic ideas, such as what exactly is culture, race, ethnicity. So culture, I would argue, as does Jones in 2008, talks about shared ideas, symbols, values, and beliefs of a group. So it's a sharing of identity, of beliefs, etc., and it can cut across different things as Janine Jones listed: SES, race, spiritual, etc. Race and ethnicity are different. Race, as defined by Markus in a really cool article in American Psychologist 2008, is a dynamic set of historically derived and institutionalized ideas and practices. That's important. Historically derived and institutionalized. It sorts people into groups according to physical and behavioral characteristics and associates different value, power, privilege, etc. with these different groups. Now, ethnicity is also a dynamic set of historically derived and institutionalized ideas and practices. I love that those two are put together as extensions of both historically derived and institutional ideas. It allows people to identify or be identified with groups of people, presumed and claimed commonalities such as language, history, nation of origin, or region of origin, customs, etc. It can be a source of meaning, action, identity, and confers a sense of belonging, pride, and motivation. So does this matter? Does race, ethnicity, culture, does all that matter when you're talking about academic interventions? Isn't teaching a kid how to read teaching a kid how to read? Well, I would argue that it does. And of course, I'm not the first to argue that. The study by three people, I'm not sure how to say their names, Gershenson, Holt, and Papagorge, 2015, interviewed a bunch of teachers, 16,000 teachers. And they found that white teachers were 30% less likely than black teachers to predict a black student would someday earn a college degree. But for white students, the predictions were about the same. And also, of course, we know that, and we know there's a relationship between teacher expectation and results for kids. If we don't have high expectations for kids, they tend not to do as well. So if we're automatically setting our expectations lower, we're hurting children. And also disproportionality, special ed, gifted achievement levels. I'm not going to spend time on that. There's a well-documented disproportionality problem in special education, where children from minority backgrounds, Black and Hispanic, etc., tend to be over-identified for special ed eligibility and served more frequently in special ed. So there might be 10% of the population is Black, but in special ed, it's 30% of the population, for example. Now, some recent research has questioned that, saying that actually we're really under-identifying children once we take into account socioeconomic status. And an article in response to that written by Dan Cohen at the University of Alabama, Chris Riley-Tillman here at the University of Missouri, John Haas, University of Massachusetts Amherst, and myself, we said, that is a result of a statistical artifact that could never play out in real life. Yes, statistically you can control for the effects of SES, but in real life you can't separate those two things out. And if we really took their findings to the extreme, then what? We'd be placing 60% of children, or 67% of children in special ed would be for minority backgrounds, thousands and thousands of kids. It just doesn't play out well in the real world. So what is cross-cultural competence? Now I'm going to rely highly on work from others from this, Janine Jones, Sam Ortiz, among others, who I highly respect with their expertise in this area. But what I've learned from them are cross-cultural competence composed of three things, according to Jones 2014: knowledge of other cultures, personal awareness, and applying the knowledge. Now I'm going to talk about knowledge of about other cultures, but I'm going to do so with some hesitancy, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. I'll tell you right now. So we talk about other cultures and learning other cultures, and oftentimes I used to teach a class where I currently train special ed teachers, and when I was training special ed teachers a while ago, I taught a class on multicultural issues in special ed, and I was sort of shocked at all the textbooks that exist, because most of them were what Jim Iseldyke calls the zoo approach to multiculturalism, which is, look, here's African American people, here's what they think, feel, believe. Here's Asian people, here's what they think, feel, believe. And I really kind of struggle with that. I don't think it's quite that simple. And it also leads to what is called a cultural learning style. The idea that a group of people have a consistent set of behaviors that are predisposed to members of a group. So for example, we used to think, and still do, many people still do, is talk about Native American children. Well, they learn more holistically, determine meaning from the whole picture. They're visual, reflective, prefer cooperation over competition, whereas African American children emphasize cooperation, discussion, hands-on activities, and whole-to-part learning. They say we can use that information to modify our instruction for children from cultural backgrounds to help them be more successful. Well, the problem is when you look at the research around it, it actually interfered with student learning. When you modify instruction based on cultural learning styles, it actually slow down student learning, not enhance it. And when you think about it, instruction activities for Native American and African American kids include cooperative learning, Socratic methods, hands-on activities, starting lessons with general overview, allowing students the opportunity for thinking and reflection. These are just good ideas. These are just good approaches to instruction. So yes, you want to do this for kids who are Native American and African American? Sure, go ahead. But you probably won't see differential effects from kids who are white or whatever. And I would argue that when we start getting to that level, we are really approaching aptitude by treatment to interaction type thinking, which of course is, for decades has shown doesn't work. These tend to go from being ways to modify instruction based on assumed differences. That's what they are. And eventually they just turn into or are created from stereotypes. A stereotype's a generalization about a group that becomes a generalization about a group, and it becomes a stereotype when it's extrapolated to a particular individual student. That's where I have a problem. And we know that variance within groups can be as great or greater than variance across groups, and you really have to be purposefully aware of your stereotypes. We're going to talk about stereotypes more in the next video, or in a future video. But be self-aware of stereotypes and recognize if you're making a decision based on a stereotype. I recently was at a sandwich shop, and I was standing in line, and it was a very busy day. This was a while ago. It was a fairly busy day. It was a long line. And there were four people working there, and all of them were African-American men, and 3 of them were roughly my age. I'm 51, roughly my age. And I walked to the first guy and said my order, and he was very nice, and it was great. And then I went down and he got it started, went to the next one, and he made the order without ever asking me what I had ordered. Then I went to the third guy who got like chips and drinks and so on. And then the fourth person, they were all men, rang up my order and never asked me what my order was. I said my order once at the beginning, and then he took the order, started it, the third guy added the extras to it, fourth guy rang it up, and I never saw them communicate from point A to point B. And I was floored by that. And it was busy. There were like 4 or 5 people in front of me, so it wasn't like I was the only person. And I was floored by that. And I asked the guy who rang me up, I'm like, how did you do that? And he simply said, we have a system. And he kind of smiled, and that was it. And I went and sat down, and I'm sitting there, I'm thinking about it, and I was really impressed by that. And I thought to myself, why was I so impressed? Was it because these are all 4 Black men? And that really sort of troubled me, and I had to think about it. Is that why? I said, no, it's because they're 4 men of my age. There's no way I could have them remember all that like they just did so it's more of an ageism, I guess, than based on race or culture, but which is not acceptable either. But the fact that but I'm encouraging you to stop and do things like that. Stop and think, why did I just make that decision? Why did I reach that conclusion? Why did I think that? And it might be very well 95% of the time you conclude, no, it wasn't a stereotype. It wasn't, it was something else. But I still encourage you to be self-aware and think of that. Knowledge about other cultures. So I do think we need to learn about other cultures. Yes, we need to know cultural norms. Yes, we need to know cultural history, especially around issues of oppression and racism. But I also would encourage you to look at the individual student and family. And Janine Jones, in her Best Practices chapter, 2014, has a multicultural interview that I really encourage everyone to look at. It's got interview questions for family, peers, race, ethnicity, personal. It's a great way to ask students and families about their own experiences, their own backgrounds. And I would argue that's as important as cultural norms and history. Both are important. I'm not saying one is more important than the other. I'm saying both are important. And if you really want to be knowledgeable about other cultures, recognize the culture is specific to the individual and learn the individual as much as the larger culture. How do you best do that? Well, this is interesting. I make this a bit analogous. I'll make the connection in a second. Everyone's probably done this at some point in time in high school or perhaps something. They did a lesson where you simulated having a disability. You wore a blindfold and walked around the school. You put on gloves and tried to put on a shirt. Try to button a shirt. Things like that. Well, we did this when I was at Central Michigan University. Our student group, our student council for exceptional children, used to do these every year. It was really fun. But then the executive board asked, well, does that really help? Does it really matter? So we did a meta-analysis, and we didn't find very many studies, 17 studies, which isn't a small amount, but it's not a large amount. And we wanted to see, look at just effect sizes, these are Cohen's D, were they effective? And you can see that we looked at disability simulated, the format, desired change, age, and duration. And you can see that physical and blind both had small effects. If we weighted it, still small effects. These are all small effects. The format, I'll come back to format in a second. Desired change, attitude and behavior, small effects. It was better for children than adults. Okay, that seemed to be true, but still a small effect, only 5 studies. And shorter ones were better than longer ones, but again, only 5 studies. A total effect size of 0.17, a small effect, not worth doing. This approach doesn't help change attitude and behavior. Now, let's go back and look at the format of the simulation. Video, 0. A weighted effect of flat out 0. The simulations we tend to talk about, the blindfolds, etc., 0.01. What had the largest effect? Actually working with kids with disabilities, or some combination thereof. Working with kids with disabilities, simulation. How do you want to learn about what it's like to have a disability? Work with children with disabilities. Flores and Smith reached that same conclusion for kids who are English language learners. Purposeful experiences with English learners, students, positively influence attitudes about language minority students. How do you learn about working with kids from different backgrounds? You work with kids from different backgrounds. I can't emphasize the importance of that strongly enough. And then self-awareness. Self-awareness, one more point about self-awareness is, I encourage you to look at some scales, and there are measures to help you sort of assess your own implicit biases. Now, I'm not going to talk much about a definition of implicit bias and a lot on that. That'll go beyond the scope of this conversation. But there's a great website here. You can go in and take a look and see what your own implicit biases are. And there are other scales that exist, and they're quite well researched, surprisingly, because most scales of this nature really aren't well researched. But this one, I found some scales here I didn't find them. Gozu found them in 2007, but they're quite well researched. So I encourage you to look at those. There's a free self-awareness implicit bias scale at that website. You can go and take for free. Again, I encourage you to do that. A couple more points about self-awareness of bias. You're probably exhibiting some implicit bias if you do some of these things. Like assume that all students know how to seek help when they're struggling. If you assume that any kid who isn't doing well knows how to come to you for help, that's an implicit bias. if you assume that kids from certain backgrounds or social groups have different intellectual abilities. I sort of struggle to think of that as implicit. That seems a lot more explicit to me. But if you think that students from different backgrounds, like kids who have free and reduced price lunch, therefore they're not going to do as well as school. That's an implicit bias, according to the Poor VU Center at Yale. Expect students who speak with certain accents to be poor writers. Assume that poor writing abilities indicates low intellectual ability. There's a big difference between unintelligent and uneducated. Treat students with physical abilities as if they may also have cognitive disabilities. Let me show you a little more information about that. Oh, okay, you have to share my screen. Slight technical difficulty. Let me get the contract here. Hit the wrong button. Okay. So let me a little more information on that. So this is a study that Renee Thelen did in 2003. She, myself, and Neil Christensen. So it's a bit old now, but it's such a cool finding. We surveyed teachers, special ed teachers, general ed teachers, high school, elementary, and we surveyed pre-service teachers as well. Kids, students who were in college. And we wanted to see their expectations around these different disability categories. And I'm sorry, this one is mild mental retardation. In 2003, that's what we still called it. Learning disabled and emotionally disabled, emotional behavior disorder, and a control group. And teachers were given one of four stories, one of four short passages about a particular student, and the passage was written very general. And it started with something like, I forget the guy's name, Tom. Tom was a good child, but when he was bad, he was very bad. That kind of thing. And it was all written very generically. Only one thing changed. They said he was a child with a disability, one of these four conditions. That was the only thing that changed across these four passages. And the teacher read them and completed the scale about their expectations for that kid. Now, a couple of things to point out. First of all, the cognitively impaired one, the cognitively disabled one, had the highest rating for interpersonal, higher than the other two. That's going back to, I think that's an implicit bias. The cute little Down syndrome kid that runs up and gives you a hug. That's the picture we have in our mind when we think of that. And then behavioral, of course, we saw low expectations for behavior across them. The lowest was emotional behavior disorder. But the thing that jumps out at me is the lowest group for academic was EBD. In order to be diagnosed with a learning disability, you have to have low achievement. In order to be diagnosed with a cognitive impairment, you have to have low achievement. You do not have to have low achievement. You have to have a disability that interferes with educational performance, but low achievement is not a criterion for emotional behavior disorder, yet that was the group that the teachers thought would do the worst on academic issues. That's definitely, I would argue, an implicit bias toward children with emotional behavior disorder. Treating students who are affiliated with a particular identity group as experts. We do this all the time in class or something. We turn to one person who's African-American and ask, what do African-American people think? Expect students of certain groups to have certain participation styles. I already talked about that. That's a cultural learning style. And then external stimuli prompt individuals to recognize and conform to negative stereotypes. These are all evidence of implicit bias. So when you think about cultural competence, be thinking about your self-awareness of your application and your cultural knowledge. The next one we'll talk about is how to take all this information and apply it across a three-tier model of intervention.